You are listening to The Culture, a podcast on race and politics.
The Culture.
Okay, just about ready.
Mount Bayou is an historic all-black town, formed many years in the 1800s by two former slaves. We don't have the overt racism that we used to have against people out in the public. Now we deal with it with employment, economics, banks. We still deal with it, and until we overcome all of that, the Delta will forever struggle, is my belief.
Now I'm gonna help them get the poly pipe loaded so they can start putting the poly pipe in.
I've been doing this all of my life. As a kid, we went to the field until it was dark, either cotton chopping or cotton picking.
The Mississippi Delta is this area between these rivers in the northwest of Mississippi that has some of the most fertile land in the United States, in the continent, really. If you go out there, you'll see rows and rows of cotton, of soybeans, every single type of crop you can imagine. But in the early 20th century, almost all the land was owned by white folks. It was homesteaded out by the federal government, or was otherwise inaccessible to black folks.
My grandpapa, Ed Scott Sr., started purchasing land back in 1938. They came from Hale County, Alabama, and they moved to Mississippi in 1919 before my dad was born. My grandmama hated it here, but in Alabama, black people could only sharecrop. No one would sell them land. Very few could get the historic 40 acres and a mule.
Ed Scott Sr. was almost supernaturally gifted at farming. He knows exactly how to rotate the crops, how to plant things in a way that gets the highest yields. And that gave him his own economic gravity that local white businessmen could not ignore. Eventually, a plantation owner decides to sell Ed Scott Sr. a plot of land.
When he passed in 1957, the family had acquired acres and acres of land.
Ed Scott's son, Ed Scott Jr., takes over the farm. He is part of the generation of men that goes off to war during World War II. And when this generation of black men comes back, their white peers are granted so many free things from the GI Bill. They get free education, lots of them get free homes, they get things they can pass on to their children. But the black men among that number are denied many of those opportunities.
My dad went to World War II, and when he came back, his dad wanted him to go and finish school. But farming is in his blood.
You had to know what you're doing to make a living here. You had to. Mom and Dad used to bale hay and sell chicken and turkeys. He used to take turkeys to Greenwood down there, and white people, and sell them.
My dad was the smartest one of his siblings and the hardest worker of his siblings. You know, every now and then he'll say, God ain't gonna make no more land, so you better hold what you got.
When Ed Scott Jr. takes over the farm, he's operating it through one of the most turbulent times in American history. 1953, the first bus boycotts. 1954, Brown v. Board. 1955, Emmett Till is lynched.
You know, I left here and went to Selma, Alabama when they had the march from Selma to Montgomery. It was rough back then, but you had to have some guts to stand up and just be rough with them.
When he owned his land, he actually had 57 families who lived on his land and worked with him. And it was like a community. Whatever we needed was on our farm. We would put up peaches, we would put up peas and butter beans, and everybody got their share to carry them across the winter. It was like a utopia.
Modern farming requires debt in order to grow your crops, in order to collect a harvest. Over the past 100 years, the federal government has become more and more of a player in providing the credit to those farmers. Much of the administration of this federal money was done by locally elected committees. And what do we know about voting in the South at that time? We know black people could not vote. The people who ended up controlling all that were the great-grandchildren of the plantation owners. And why would they ever give a black farmer money to start his own farm? And so between 1950 and 1969, black farmers lose something on the order of 6 million acres of land across the country. But the Scots were able to hold on to most of their land until the farm crisis of the 1970s and 1980s.
Rising fuel costs, increasing cost of production, new taxes, these changes will have a significant impact on the well-being of family farmers. Federal legislators are slashing farm programs to pay for the deficit.
As farming in America collapses in the 70s and 80s, there's a lifeline in the Mississippi Delta: catfish. The federal government, they pour a whole bunch of money into taking these poor white farmers who are struggling, getting them into catfish. The people who are left out of that are the black farmers. Ed Scott Jr. sees what's happening. He sees catfish as a way out. He converts most of his farms into 8 giant catfish ponds with no help from the federal government. He digs them himself. He builds the very first catfish plant owned and operated by an African American in the United States. And it becomes this inspirational story across the South of a black person who has literally beat all the odds to create something new.
My dad loved clothes, and he loved to dress. Even on a daily basis, he wore what we call khaki suits, which would have been a khaki shirt with matching pants, and they had to be starched and ironed. He always had a nice new car, but he kept it closed up in a shed so no one would know he had it. He did not commingle, meaning white people would call staying in your place. Well, no black's supposed to have a car.
There's gonna come a time when they think you're uppity. And that's exactly what happened to the Scots.
It wasn't just because we were black, it's because we was doing so well in farm. We were doing so well.
Blacks were never successful at getting enough money to farm with from USDA. So when they went in to get the money for the crop, they gave them half of what they need, which was the way of keeping blacks from being successful. Because if you're gonna grow beans and you say, I need this much for fertilizer, I need this much for crop protection, I need this much for seeds, and I need this much for watering, and you only get half of that, there's no way for you to produce a good crop.
Yeah, they used to try to buy no land in Mississippi. You never own no land in Mississippi. White people ain't gonna let you own no land in Mississippi. That's what the county agent will tell me.
It's documented. They did not offer him the same loan terms, They regularly offered him much smaller loans than they did white farmers in the area.
The county agent, he refused to give him a loan. So he could not feed his fish, could not water his crops. They foreclosed on his land.
I highlight this story because this is the story of many African Americans all over this country, particularly in the South. Between 1910 and 1997, African Americans lost about 90% of their land. In the early 1900s, as black families prospered through farming and land ownership, whites, through terrorism, lynching, and violence, stole black land with the backing of the local, state, and federal governments. In my first episode, I talked about July Perry and the Ocoee Massacre, and how the massacre wasn't entirely motivated by the black people voting. It was motivated by the wealth they created through land ownership. After lynching black people to take their land was no longer legal, there was a more sophisticated approach of oppression where banks and the government entities wouldn't loan money for black land ownership. After decades of not being able to access a loan, yet another strategy was put in place. Because of decades of government-supported land theft and outright hostility toward people of color, generations of black landowners haven't left a will. Instead, they let the land become what is called heirs property, a form of ownership in which descendants inherit an interest, like holding stock in a company. The practice began during Reconstruction, when many African Americans didn't have access to the legal system. And it continued through the Jim Crow era, when black communities were suspicious of white Southern courts. In the United States today, 76% of African Americans do not have a will, more than twice the percentage of white Americans. Many assume that not having a will keeps land in the family. In reality, it jeopardizes ownership. It's considered by many experts the worst problem you've never heard of. It's the leading cause of black land loss. Heirs property is estimated to make up more than a third of Southern black-owned land, 3.5 million acres worth more than $28 billion. These landowners are vulnerable to laws and loopholes that allow developers to take their property. In simple terms, this is how it happens. A developer finds an heir and offers them a very low price for their share of the property, let's say $500. After buying that landowner's share, the developer now becomes a de facto owner, and he has just as much right as any other heir. Now that developer can decide to force the sale of the property against the will of the other heirs, many times without the heirs even knowing. The developer can now decide to offer to buy the entire property, because he's an heir, from the rest of the heirs, let's say for a price of $100,000. If none of the heirs can match that price, then the developer gets the entire property for $100,000, even though it may be worth millions. This year, I passed a bill called the Partition of Heirs Property Act that closed this legal loophole so that heir property owners can be protected. I also passed a bill requiring the Ocoee Massacre to be taught in schools and victims of the massacre be named on schools and state facilities. All of this is a great start, and I'm proud to have sponsored these initiatives. But what about the trillions of dollars worth of land that was either stolen or denied black people over this past century? How do we account for that? How do we justify that? I believe we can't right this wrong without reparations being a part of the conversation. I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you for listening to The Culture. To lend your views on this topic or other issues of interest to you, please go to randolphbracy.com or follow @Randolph Bracy on all platforms.
The culture.